Good evening. My name is Michael Marsicano, and I have the privilege of directing Foundation for the Carolinas. I am delighted to welcome you to this next chapter in a very important conversation, one we have been having on a challenging topic our community has decided to embrace as a defining moment opportunity. In a few minutes, I will invite my Foundation colleague, Brian Collier, to the podium for more formal introductions of our special guests, including Robert Putnam, whose research is so well placed in the context of the Economic Opportunity Task Force. The work of this task force and its pending civic engagement activities make up the most recent civic leadership initiative of the Foundation, this time in a strong partnership with the Mecklenburg County Commission and the Charlotte City Council. Now, when I think of the Economic Opportunity Task Force as our most recent civic initiative, it is fitting to define it as such in the presence of Bob Putnam. How many of you have attended one of our annual meeting luncheons with successive all-star casts of speakers? If so, raise your hands. Your hands are witness to the fact that this annual event has become our city's community convocation. It brings together 1,500 cross-sector leaders from the public, private, and independent sectors for the delivery of provocative perspectives that influence our civic psyche. The annual event began 15 years ago with a very dynamic speaker who had just written a most compelling book on the subject of social capital, entitled Bowling Alone. The speaker was Robert Putnam. While Bob's research and inspiring remarks led to a cascade of social capital building work in Charlotte, we can trace major changes in the mission of Foundation for the Carolinas to the seeds he planted at that first annual meeting. Pre-Putnam, we had a single mission, best described as the building of philanthropic capital. Post-Putnam, we have dual missions. The building of philanthropic capital certainly remains, but it is now paired with the equally important mission of civic leadership. And virtually all of our civic leadership work is distinguished with elements of thought leadership, civic engagement, and social capital building. The latter, social capital building, directly tied to the influence of Robert Putnam now 15 years ago. What we could not have predicted when we embraced a dual mission was how well the two would feed one another. The more we took on highly visible civic leadership activities that we hope have been highly impactful, the more donors opened funds at the Foundation or gave generously to the civic work itself. This has been the power of our Robinson Center for Civic Leadership. And the results have been an exponential increase in assets, which in turn generated greater resources to the Foundation for Civic Leadership initiatives, which in turn leads to growth in assets, and the cycle just continues. Pre-Putnam, we held about $250 million in assets. Post-Putnam today, we hold approximately $1.7 billion in assets. Now, I cannot, and I do not attribute all of this to Bob Putnam. It would be foolish of me to do so. We know it takes a village. But I can say Bob's visit to Charlotte in the year 2000 was a defining moment we can only recognize as such years later. So perhaps, just perhaps, we will look back someday on his visit to Charlotte in 2015 as another defining moment. So Bob, if I have set high expectations for you tonight, know that it was very much my intention to do so, and I have no doubt you will deliver. At this time, I invite Brian Collier, the Foundation's steward of our civic leadership work, to make the formal introductions and to bring us a brief update on the Economic Opportunity Task Force. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Michael, and let me join him in thanking all of you for turning out tonight. This is a wonderful crowd. Before we get too far into the night, I want to thank as well Susan Patterson and the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation for helping make tonight happen. They were very generous in helping out with this. Judging by the size of this great crowd, it's clear that this issue of mobility and opportunity is really resonating with the residents here in Charlotte-Mecklenburg. It's top of mind for many of you. In fact, over the last couple of weeks, we've had a number of sold-out events that have used mobility or opportunity as their focal point. Many of you might have attended the speech a couple of weeks ago with Brian Stevenson from Levine Museum, or last week's discussion with UNCC around A Dream Deferred again. Both of these were sold out, and wonderful conversations about this community and helping to provide context of how we got to where we are today. Your presence tonight is also proof that Charlotte-Mecklenburg is a place that is willing to confront truths that may conflict with the story that we tell ourselves every day about this, Charlotte being the place where the American dream can come true. We know from several studies that this is not true universally for all residents here in our community. And in fact, you can predict to great detail the trajectory of a child based on where they were born. One of the most important things that we're about to embark on to look at this issue is the creation of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Opportunity Task Force. Its work is now underway under the leadership of Dr. Ophelia Garman-Brown and Dee Odell. The task force members gathered for their first meeting a couple weeks ago, and I want to thank them in advance for their hard work and their dedication to this effort. If there are members of the task force in the audience, I'd ask that you please stand now and be recognized. While the task force is leading the vanguard on this issue, we know that the effort to broaden access to opportunity is one shared by our entire community, and it will take all of us to meet this challenge. There's a lot of special people in the room tonight, but I do want to recognize two groups in particular. I want to recognize first if we have any students of CMS or private independent schools in the audience, and also teachers in our private and CMS schools. Anyone in the audience? Come on. Bruns Academy of Families and teachers. Where are Bruns Academy folks? Well, as I said earlier, this issue is complex, and we're going to need the entire community. And I want to ask everyone in this room tonight to sign up for the task force. On our website, you can see up here, you can find out more information at opportunitycharmec.org. And we'd ask that you also like or follow us on Twitter and Facebook. And after signing up on the website, you will be able to find out more information about the issue of opportunity, upcoming events, and begin receiving updates and invitations on where to participate and how to participate in their activities. But you're not done. My hope is that you will also ask your friends, family members, parents at the schools to also sign up, because we want them to be engaged in this discussion. So between now and the end of 2015, you're going to hear a lot from the task force. They're going to be very busy over the next several months, digging into the complex issues that are entwined in this issue of opportunity and mobility. They are going to spend a lot of their time understanding Charlotte's opportunity structure, how it was created, why it exists the way that it does, and how we can then weaken the barriers that prevent some of our children from having their share in the American dream. And then we're going to share this knowledge back out to the community and offer ways for you to participate in the discussion. So one of the ways that the Foundation is participating in this collective work is through our learning series. Many of you have attended the events that started with Aaron Collier from Pew Charitable Trust in November, followed up by Richard Reeves of Brookings, and our last panel discussion in March, which was fabulous, with Bruce Katz, Joe Jones from Baltimore, and Scott Winship. I'm honored that each of these speakers has been so taken with what they've seen here in Charlotte that they have stayed in touch with us and they've offered to help us along this journey. And we're going to be bringing more speakers to the community in the future. So before I bring up Richard and get to what you've all come here for tonight, I want to remind you of the overarching theme that I laid out for many of you back in November. I want you to keep this in the back of your mind as we go through the discussions and the conversations tonight. What if Charlotte had one narrative that gave us a strategic guide to how we make decisions in this community? What if we used economic opportunity, mobility as that guide and as a focal point for the community? In other words, before we took any action as donors, as funders, as community leaders, as leaders of our government, before we took any action, we would ask, how does this impact the issue of opportunity for our children both now and in the future? If we lived up to that goal of asking that singular question, we could then tell our children that you live in a community that once you exert hard work and strong character, you can achieve the American dream. To quote Richard's most recent blog, society has a collective responsibility to create opportunities for the least advantaged. The individual has the responsibility to take them. Tonight, I'm very happy to welcome back our friend and official member of our Charlotte Opportunity Team, Richard Reeves. He will lead off our program and introduce our guest speaker, Robert Putnam. Some of you were introduced to Richard at our meeting in December, but for those who weren't, let me tell you just a little bit about his background and why we claim him so special to this community. Richard is a senior fellow at Brookings Institute. He's a senior fellow in economic studies and policy director of the Center on Children and Families. And he's editor-in-chief of the Social Mobility Memos blog. I highly commend that you read that. Wonderful information on a weekly basis. His research focuses on social mobility, inequality, and family change. Prior to Brookings, he was Director of Strategy to the UK's Deputy Prime Minister, and his publications for Brookings include Saving Horatio Alger, Equality, Opportunity, and the American Dream, and The Parenting Gap. He's also a contributor to The Atlantic and The Wall Street Journal. But most of you probably know Richard from his starring role in the Lego version of Opportunity. And I have seen that video so many times that I now hear it in my sleep. And so with that, Richard, I'd like to invite you up to the stage.
Thank you, Brian. And if you haven't seen the 3-minute YouTube Lego video, I strongly encourage you to do so, because I have a bet with a friend that I can get more views than him. So, yeah, that's me. I'm not going to speak for very long because you're not here to hear from me, but I am going to say that you're in for a real treat. I think this will be a very special evening. I can't say that we'll be talking about pre and post in quite the same way, but I like the aspiration behind that. But you are in for a real treat. I should say I'm slightly biased. I recently had the chance to spend time with Robert Putnam and to listen to him in Boston and in Washington, so now in Charlotte. I'm essentially a groupie. Some people, I gather, follow Bruce Springsteen around. I follow Bob Putnam around. But it's a sign of how seriously he took preparation for this evening and the discussion we had this evening, that last week in DC he had a kind of trial run. He did a warm-up panel last week in DC with E.J. Dionne, the head of the American Enterprise Institute, and some guy called Barack Obama, to talk about this. So this is someone who takes his preparation very, very seriously indeed. So officially, Robert Putnam is the Malcolm Professor of Public Policy at Harvard University. Of course, that doesn't capture anything like his importance to social science and to politics, and to the way that he's shaped so many conversations in this country. I rather like the New York Times description of him as the poet laureate of civic society, or civil society. I think that gets much closer to the truth of it. Because I'm a groupie, I get the chance to sit for a little while and ask my own questions of Professor Putnam before opening it up to discussion with you, but I promise not to take up all the time, because I'm sure you'll have questions to ask him as well. And at the risk of embarrassing Professor Putnam still further, I'd just like to say that I'm interested in the role of public intellectuals. And by that I mean people who combine scholarship with a desire to change the world. And In Robert Putnam, we have something rather special, because we have someone who is a public intellectual in the very, very best sense of the term. Somebody who combines impeccable scholarship with real compassion and with real passion to use that scholarship to change the world. So in that sense, it's quite rare to find someone who has such scholarly integrity, but also such real intent to use that scholarship to make the world a somewhat better place, a combination of head and heart, if you like, in the work that Robert Putnam does. And so it is my very great privilege to be here with you and to welcome to the stage, please join me in welcoming Sir Robert, I'm sorry, I wasn't supposed to tell you about the knighthood. Professor Robert Putnam. I told you were in for a treat. Sir Bob, can I call you that now?
Sure.
I've got 1,000 questions, but I'm going to restrict myself to a couple because I really do want to open up to the many questions I'm sure that are out there. And I think people are also tweeting or emailing in questions as well. So if someone rushes up with a piece of paper, that'll be why. You've now been on the road talking about the book to audiences like this, to the president last week, to academic audiences, local audiences, students. What's been the thing that has surprised you the most in the reaction you've got, or put it differently, what would you now say differently or amplify differently from the book as a result of having kind of engaged with people?
Well, people have been very kind and generous in their comments about the book. They have responded, as frankly I hope they would, to the pictures. I don't mean the visual pictures, I mean the stories. There are a lot of stories in the book, more stories than graphs. Stories like Mary Sue, but a lot of others from all over the country. And people have responded strongly to that, so strongly that actually I found people felt the book as more of a downer than I did when I wrote it. Because people think, this is just too big a problem. How are we going to fix this problem? And that's why actually the talk you heard tonight is a little different from the talk that you would have heard a month ago, because I'm now trying to get Americans to see, yes, this is a really big problem. I think it's a terrible problem, but I also think we've done this before. This is not, I'm not trying to make America Sweden. I'm trying to make us just like we used to have we faced this same problem. By the way, I do not mean that America was perfect in the 50s and 60s. I certainly don't think that. We've made lots and lots of progress along many dimensions. But in terms of opportunity based on social class, we're a lot worse, but not any worse than we were in 1890, and then people fixed it. And a lot of people have asked me, so what are you going to do about it? As if I knew the answer to that. Some reviewer, you may have read this review, said he diagnoses cancer and then prescribes aspirin.
Just so everybody knows, that was my review of which I would be upset, except that you've now revealed that you actually read the review, which makes me happier. So.
I should have said before, this guy, you should read this social mobility blog as he writes. Is that what it's called? The social mobility?
Social mobility memo, yeah.
Huh? Social mobility memo. It is required reading. I mean, really seriously now, it's the first thing I read every morning.
I agree with you completely. But so at the end, you talked about Charlotte and Mecklenburg. The trends you showed were national trends based on national data, but the work particularly of people like Raj Chetty, also from Harvard, which is in a sense why this series started, put Charlotte 50th out of 50 in terms of upward mobility.
Right.
The new Chetty study, in terms of the impact of where you grow up on your earnings, puts Charlotte 99th out of 100. The only one that's worse is Baltimore City. That's at county level. And so so there's a tension perhaps between the national trend and then the local call. What do you think about the connection between the national trends you've observed and described and what's happening at a local level? Do you think is everything just going to hold equally here? All those factors the same from you and
Well, no, I mean, there are differences from place to place across America. Of course there are. We know that from Chetty's study. We know that, I guess it's the Salt Lake City, for whatever reason, turns out to have the highest rate of upward mobility. And we know from Chetty's work, and actually it's interesting that his work and my work completely coincide. We know what the big 5 factors are. We know what Chetty said, and I would say single-parent families. That's an important inhibitor of upward mobility, the degree to which there are single-parent families in a community. Income inequality in a community is really bad for upward mobility. The more the country, the city or community has lots of rich people and lots of poor people, the harder it is for poor people to climb the ladder. Thirdly, segregation, he uses exactly the same variable that I do, the degree to which people are living in different places, and that's increasingly true across the country. What I call social capital, and he does too, that is this measure of the degree to which people are cooperating with one another. It's what you've been working on here at the Foundation for the Carolinas. And schools, that's the fifth big point.
School quality. And that's actually, when you then look at those factors and wonder which you can actually do something about, people will tend to think schooling. And they might think, particularly K-12, right? Because you think K-12 is when we have the kids. That might be when we can narrow the gaps. It's harder to do anything about family formation or the labour market. And so I'm interested to know how far you think schools are the answer, because that's the usual claim. Well, if we fix the schools, we'll fix the problem. But I'm not quite sure that's your position.
No, it isn't my position, actually. First of all, we have a very bad habit in America of blaming schools for all of our problems, and then...
I think there's a lot of teachers in the room who agree with that.
The best evidence is that schools did not cause this problem. I'm not talking about Charlotte Mecklenburg. Maybe here they did, but I'm...
Yeah, we'll find out and get back to you.
Nationwide, schools did not cause this problem. Schools modestly narrow the opportunity gap. Now, you might say, look, schools are supposed to completely eliminate the opportunity gap. So you could say, well, schools could be doing more, but that's different from saying schools cause this. This is not a schools cause problem. You can see that in many ways because the gaps between kids that I'm talking about, this opportunity gap, is fully formed before kids even get to school. And their kids are in different kinds of schools. The most important thing about a school is who else is there. If you go to school with rich kids, whether you're rich or poor, that helps you, it turns out. And if you go to schools with poor kids, that doesn't help you, regardless of whether you're rich or poor. And this does get, actually, to the fact that we have kids in such different schools, now increasingly in high-income and low-income schools, is part of the problem. Schools didn't cause that, but that's because of the residential segregation. That's where we are. I can think of only 3 broad solutions to that, frankly, and I think Charlotte Mecklenburg is actually, these ought to be on your agenda to talk about. You can move the parents by having some more open housing so that there's more of a mixture between rich families and poor families. Or you can move the kids. Not moving the parents, but moving the kids. And the Charlotte Mecklenburg plan did that. And I'm not an expert on what happened next. Or you could move the money. And that's another possibility.
So schools may not be the cause, but they may be part of the solution, I think.
Yeah, and especially, I just have to say this very quickly, especially early childhood education. Early childhood education is as close to a magic bullet as we have. I'm happy to go down way into the weeds on the data here. Early childhood education really does pay for itself, but it can't be cheap. You have to have, it can't be, glorified babysitting. It's got to be professional people teaching these kids. But if you do that, it does way pay off the results of high investment.
I've been handed some questions, one of which overlaps with something I wanted to ask you about anyway, which is the question of race.
Right.
So the question I've been handed is whether the South is particularly challenged to build opportunity because of the history here of racial segregation, racial oppression. But I'm interested to hear you say a little bit more about the relationship between race and class and income, because you said quite a few times, by the way, this is true of white Americans and black Americans.
Right.
But it's also true that a lot of the gaps between white and black Americans in mobility, wealth, income, and family formation remain very, very high. So even if there's been a move in the white population, the race gaps are very significant indeed.
They are.
So how do you square, and even Chetty's work shows that predominantly black areas have lower upward mobility. He also shows that white people in those areas have lower mobility. So it's not race in itself. But of course, most of the people who live in those areas are by definition black, and so that does have a big effect on the mobility patterns.
Yeah, and one can't escape talking about race in this context. I'm a little uneasy about starting a conversation, me, a white guy from the north, starting a conversation here in the South about race. But I think, here's what I think. There are deep historical racial injustices and disparities that have not gone away. In some places, we've made some progress on some of those disparities. But the change that I'm talking about, this growing gap, is not about race. It's about class. And the way to think of that is poor black kids or non-white kids now have not only all of the historic racial burdens that they're bearing, but laid on top of that are some new purely class burdens that they share with poor white kids. I want to be very clear. I'm not saying we've solved race. We haven't solved race. But we overlaid on that this other even bigger problem, which is the growing class gaps in America. And it is true that the lower rates of upper mobility, not entirely, but tend to be concentrated heavily in the Southeast, and probably that has some relationship to the history of slavery. But it's, I'm not sure if it's going to be any comfort to folks suffering from the legacies of that to know that there are very similar problems now that are hitting white working class kids, even in my lily white hometown.
Okay, I'll ask my last question and then we'll go out to the audience. In the very moving story you told about Mary Sue, but also in your book, many of those who are most disadvantaged seem to become more disadvantaged as a result of the way that families are formed or the way that kids come into the world.
Sure.
Over and over again you hear a story of I didn't mean to get pregnant, but there's accidental pregnancies, accidental childbearing, very quite sort of chaotic environments, and you use single parenthood as a way of describing that. Can you say a little bit about the relationship between family structure and family stability, and also a little bit about how far we can do anything about this anyway? I mean, my colleague Isabel Sawhill would say, look, the world of marriage is gone. The average American is now sexually active for 10 years before they get marriage. Let's get over the obsession with marriage and do something else. But I don't know where you come out, because in a way that's the most depressing part of the story, because it also feels very difficult to do anything about those sorts of processes that are leading to the accidental births and pregnancies you've described.
Right. And like everything about this topic, it's not easy to discuss this. I think the best evidence is that what's really bad for kids growing up is instability in who is in the home. That is to say, if there is a dad and he's gone, that's bad for the kids. If there is a dad and he's gone now, there's a new dad, that's even worse for the kids. If they're kind of kaleidoscopic adults moving into and out of the family, as is increasingly true. And it was true in Mary Sue's case. That's exactly what was happening in Mary Sue's case. I even told you that about, the other woman comes in and then... we know that's bad for development. I'm not making a moral judgment about... Maybe I am in a way making a moral judgment, but not on Victorian grounds. But the kids pay a consequence of that toing and froing. Now, there is this debate, which, in fact, as you know, Richard and I and his colleague Bill Saul have been involved in a discussion about how much of this could you solve by having particularly effective birth control. And if most of these pregnancies are unintended pregnancies, then maybe long-acting reversible contraceptives would be a big solution. That's what Richard and Bell believe. I think that actually, if you actually talk to the people involved, often it's not clear whether they intended to have the pregnancy or not. People in our book say, well, it was sort of semi-intended. And that's, if there's a lot of those...
It was ambiguous. Kind of
right.
So it seems to me, you are making a moral claim. You're just not making a moral claim about structure in itself. So you're not saying it's immoral to somehow kind of have children or raise families outside of an institution. But I do think you're making a moral claim about parenting. and about intentionality of parenting and the commitment between parenting. I think that emerges very strongly. I think you are saying to us quite strongly that it's just wrong to bring a child into the world and then neglect them or ignore them or not help them to develop.
I am saying that, but I want to be careful because there's a larger meta-narrative in Western culture that traces everything to fallen women, and I'm trying to stay really far away from that. That's not... No, I mean, I'm not... Please, I'm now being really serious. My daughter, who's a historian, thinks I'm going to get labeled as the guy who brought, the Scarlet Letter back to America. That's not what I want to do. I'm saying let's think about the kids.
Right. But you also say it's harder to parent in hard circumstances. So you're making both claims. That's why it's purple. Okay, so we're going to open up. I assume there are mics roving around, are there? Or how are we doing this? Are there? I should be better organised. So if you have a question, please raise your hands. I have a couple here that have come in that have been handed to me as well.
Use the cards for right now.
Use the cards for right now. Okay. So are they being handed? Is that how we're doing? They're coming in. Apologies for me being disorderly. This is a good one. How can we encourage people to care about solutions that will take a long time? One of the struggles with looking at this intergenerational opportunity that you look at and that we're both interested in is it takes a generation to change a generational problem. Most politicians tend to, and policymakers, and even some foundations, present company entirely accepted, operate on much shorter timescales than that, and they want results, they want ROI, they want results, they want impact within a matter of months or maybe a few years. How then can we persuade people to stick with this? I can imagine here there's a lot of energy, there'll be more energy tonight, but will that energy still be here in 5 years? Will it still be here in 10 years? How do you lock it in? How do you commit to it?
Well, first of all, I want to say, because it's part of that question, I really believe in evidence-based policymaking. So you've got to be sure, you've got to have the best evidence that whatever you're proposing to do will actually work. And all of the items that are on this list, they're there partly because we know that if we did them, there's good evidence, they would work. They would begin to have the opportunity gap. So it's not just pure faith. But faith is important. Because the people in around 1900 who were inventing the high school, most of them didn't live to see what a fabulous invention it was. Right? I mean, they were making a bet. Seems to us like this is the reasonable decision to make sure that all of our kids get a decent start in life. They were completely right. But they weren't actually, and those of us who are of a certain age, I mean, I know that this problem, I am quite confident America will solve this problem, but it's not going to, it'll be solved after, I've moved on. And almost every important thing that America has done has taken a long time. I mean, this idea that we shouldn't do things if they're hard or they're going to take a long time, that's not, I'm now going to sound just like a simple-minded patriot. Settling this country was not a short-term deal. Doing big, important things, especially for kids, takes a lot of time, and you have to pay attention to the evidence, but it takes a certain amount of faith that if we just keep at this, America, or in this case, Charlotte Mecklenburg, will be a better place.
I have a question here about school and neighbourhood segregation, which you've mentioned as a big part of your work, but in particular how it kind of relates to solutions. And maybe I can motivate this by thinking about social capital. Social capital is what made you famous, and it certainly appears to have made you very famous here. And you distinguish in your work between bonding social capital and bridging social capital. Bonding social capital, basically making existing communities even more tightly knit. Bridging social capital being the kind of connections between different communities. And I remember a long time ago you used to say if you could wave a magic wand and increase one or the other, which would you wave? And it seems to me you're describing a world in which the lack of bridging social capital, a gap between the kinds of communities that people live in and other people, which is breeding a sort of perhaps just lack of knowledge, ignorance, certainly lack of empathy, lack of understanding, and so on. So first of all, is that a consequence of the segregation that you talk about? And if so, what are the sorts of solutions we should be looking to break down both the economic gap and to some extent the empathy gap that you described?
Well, look, that's all the questions you're asking, Richard, or they're asking, or you guys are asking, are tough questions, and that's a real one. It is certainly true that a big part of my concern, if I use the jargon for just a moment, is the collapse of class-bridging social capital in America. I apologize, that sounds like I'm teaching a graduate seminar or something. All that means is people from different levels in American society are decreasingly exposed to people from other levels. And if we go down that road very far, we're moving toward a caste society. I mean, there's just no doubt. If we just lived in completely separate, enclaves, and our kids don't play on the same teams and don't go to the same churches and that's the way we're headed. That's going to be bad for the whole country. Now, I'm kind of betting we haven't gone down that road far enough that it's too late to begin to recognize the common humanity. The book, How the Other Half Lives, was a bet that Americans in 1890 had not lost the capacity for empathy across that class gap on the east side of New York. The book called The Other America, which was another book like this, written in the 1960s, said to affluent Americans in the 1960s, sure, you're happy, and that's wonderful, it's great for you, but did you know there's another America out there? And that book also had the effect of making people alert to what was going on. And it's part of the story behind the Great Society and the War on Poverty and so on. I'm not at all claiming that our kids is in that same league, but it is in that genre. That's what so partly, Richard, I'm betting that there are enough of us on the upside of the gap who still have a sense that, that we're all in this together. And the numbers look like that. This is not a case where this is just out of altruism. It's a case where we are, in fact, all of this together. So, I don't know. I mean, you probably can tell I'm a disappointed evangelical preacher.
Well,
and a secular Jew at that.
I think you're just evangelical for different things, Bob. So I will, in a moment, just start taking questions directly from the audience as well. There's a couple more here I'd like to get through. One, and I know you've done a bit of work on this, Bob, it's about obesity and health problems more generally. So the question is specifically about obesity, but one of the things that emerges from your book is the way that different advantages and disadvantages layer on top of each other. It seems as if it's like one thing after another. And obesity as as an expression of disadvantage emerges as well as a gap. So how is that? Talk about that as both a cause and a consequence of this crisis.
First of all, the basic facts. There's a chart in the book. If you want to get the book, if you want to see the chart, you have to get the book. But
no one's leaving until they bought the book.
The chart, most of the scissors graphs, you know what I mean by the scissors graphs that look like this? The scissors graph for obesity, I can't do with my fingers because the upper graph, that is rich kids, our kids, the obesity epidemic was over 20 years ago. Obesity among kids coming from college-educated homes, it has been going down for 20 years. So that graph looks like that. But obesity among kids coming from high school-educated homes is accelerating. So it looks like that. And so it's I would say, a wonderful example, except it's a wonderful example of a horrible trend, right? It shows how we are increasingly living, our kids are increasingly living in two different worlds. It's not entirely clear why it looks like that. It looks like it's mostly about exercise and not mostly about calories, but it could also be about calories. It's an interesting case to explore. I mean, this is a scientific case, but it has real big consequences because, of course, childhood obesity is a strong predictor of adult diabetes, and that's why, one of the reasons why my Miriam is going to end up poorer because we've not invested in Mary Sue is that Mary Sue is going to get really sick really early and for a really long time, and unless we just leave her lying on the street in Port Clinton, somebody's going to pay for that. And that's why this obesity and the other health examples of this growing gap illustrate that this is not, that we actually, in a sense, are all in this together.
Last question from the cards, and then we'll go out. So I think have you got a mic as well, Leila? Yeah, okay, so there's mics on both sides. So do raise your hands if you have a kind of question, and then one of these gentlemen will come to you. Last question then from here. It's about gender in a way. This is a question about college enrollment by gender.
Right.
The fact that now 3 out of 5 of those coming out of four-year colleges are women rather than men. You describe Port Clinton as a world where the fathers went to work. There's clearly been a revolution in gender roles and gender relationships in that time. Can you talk a bit about how that revolution influences your thinking about how to solve this crisis? Because on the face of it, you might say, look, the women should be the breadwinners now. Women are outpacing men, and actually we're not going back to the world of Port Clinton where we had male breadwinners. We now need to rethink the role of breadwinner and maybe rethink the role of parent.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, I think I'll not touch that.
Well, you know what I mean by that, right?
No, I'm
the
sorry.
male breadwinner model.
Yeah, no, I got it. I got it. I got it. So let me say just the facts, because Portland turns out to be typical. When girls and boys, men and women, left Portland High School, they went in equal numbers to college. Equal numbers. About half of the boys and half of the girls went to college. 80% of the boys who went to college finished. 20% of the girls who went to college got a degree. And those numbers, so men overwhelmingly were predominant in well-educated, were getting much higher level of education than women were in that period, and it was related obviously to the male-dominant society. As you probably all know, those figures have now reversed, and women are much more likely to get a college degree than, not much, but are somewhat more likely to get a college degree than men. Why that is actually not entirely clear. There are a number of ideas, and I don't want to claim that I'm an expert. One of them actually is that single-parent families are worse for boys because mostly they don't have a dad present, and there is some evidence that sons are more negatively influenced by living in a single-parent family than daughters are. There may be other reasons for that trend, but look, it's important to realize that all of these pathologies that I'm talking about are not characteristic of the upper third of American society. The upper third of American society, that is us, basically. If you're college educated, I'm now talking to you, we and our kids have basically an Ozzie and Harriet kind of family structure. It's a very stable family structure. It's different in two respects. One is Ozzie's spending more time with the kids than he used to, and Harriet is now working as a lawyer or a social worker. And therefore they have two incomes, and their kids are in terrific shape. That's right, that's my grandchildren. They're all in terrific shape. And so, in answering your question about how do we want to change the structure of American society, the gendered structure of American society, we have to keep in mind that the gendered structure of American society for people on the upside of the opportunity gap is doing just fine, actually. It's the real problem is the structures down below, and I'm a little bit uneasy about trying to prescribe what gender structure should be like in that bottom third of the society.
Okay, so let's go out.
Go to that side of the room.
Over here. So, do we have any hands over here? Yeah, let's go down there. Feel free to tell us who you are or not.
Thank you very much. My name is Sam. I actually read all of your books for my poli-sci major.
And for the love of it.
So my question sort of dovetails into Bowling Alone and civil society. So how do we prevent a positive feedback loop of only affluent people, only people from one class entering civil society, entering leadership positions, entering the roles as gatekeepers for upward mobility, and having only really one perspective and one background and one class represented in leadership roles?
Of course, that's a tough question, but it's important to keep in mind that this problem that I'm describing, that is this extreme gap between the opportunities and challenges that face rich kids and poor kids, is not been uniformly true of American society for all time. This is not like forever and ever we're condemned to this kind of two-tier hierarchy, and it's not true all over America. There are places in America where it's more true and places where it's less true. And those two facts, the fact that this is not a constant across time, that is the degree of the gap is not a constant across time, and it's not a constant across space, gives us leverage for learning, for looking to places that, where the gap, looking for places and times where the gap wasn't as great as it has become. So that's implicitly what I'm saying here. I agree with you, there's a direct connection between the collapse of social capital that I described in Bowling Alone and the shriveling of our kids. Meaning, those I didn't know that until I finished this book, that I suddenly saw that the reason that the shriveling has happened was because of the decline of social capital. Of course, I'm not saying that if we just all went bowling together, we'd fix the problem. But I am trying to jumpstart a national conversation about these issues. Because I fundamentally think when Americans see that we've got a problem, we actually can often fix it. That I'm really believe that. So I'm not at all, thinking, well, we're never going to get back there, or never going to. Charlotte Mecklenburg is never going to become like Salt Lake City. Well, of course, it won't be exactly like Salt Lake City, but Salt Lake City must be doing something right, besides, being Mormon. And we must have been doing something right in a period when the gap wasn't as great as it is now.
Yeah, it's hard to get a policy out of that, isn't it? Over there. Back.
Hello, I'm Carol Sawyer. In Charlotte Mecklenburg, we made the decision to, when busing ended, to move money and not children. However, there was never really enough money to support children in isolated poverty. And the philanthropic community stepped in and actually poured more money into schools, basically further funding segregation. How can we turn that around so that rather than funding segregation with philanthropic dollars, which it's not clear that there is enough money to truly give children in isolated poverty opportunity, how do we convince the community that integration on economic/racial grounds is actually the longer-term solution and probably more financially viable?
Well, as I said before, you can move the parents, you can move the kids, or you can move the money, and that's the order in which they would be effective. That is, moving the parents would be the most effective, because then, by that I mean, if you have integrated neighborhoods, then the kids are getting to know each other. The next most effective is moving the kids in some kind of, and you should all know that the Charlotte Mecklenburg experiment in I don't know what it's called here, but the experiment that is no longer in practice, but that was, has a national reputation. Nationally, you guys are known for that worked. But for whatever reason, you decided not to pursue that. And I mean, actually, did I just step in something? I don't know.
Yeah.
But if you for whatever reason you can't do the moving families and you can't do the moving kids, moving the money is the least bad alternative. Not doing anything is really, really dumb. It is dumb because I can tell you, Charlotte will be poor 10 years from now if you don't do something about raising that mobility rate. Or to put it another way, Charlotte has just had a pretty good run here. I mean, think how much even better you'd be doing if you just could address this question of the low mobility. That's a real opportunity there. But as to whether, I'm not a politician, so I'm not a Charlotte politician, so I don't know what the right way to make it work is.
Do you understand the resistance that some people have to greater integration? I'm thinking now about economic segregation, and one of the things that affluent parents do is buy their way into better zip codes with better schools, and then in some ways they may well see it as against their interests to move towards greater integration, because to put it bluntly, it means that the kids the schools that they've successfully filled up with kind of affluent kids, and I heard from a bunch of high schoolers earlier about the divide between the schools. How do if I'm a parent and I've used my financial power to get into a school district, which I have, of course, not here but somewhere else, which is great, then how do you persuade me that it's in my interest to make those schools more mixed?
Well, I just spent the whole evening trying to persuade you that it's in my interest.
I'm persuaded, by the way, but I suspect that even among so-called liberals in my neighbourhood, I'm the exception rather than the rule.
Yeah, of course, you are.
It's a sort of self-interest, collective interest.
Absolutely. No, I got it. I'm not, forgive me, Richard, I'm not certainly not being critical of you personally, and the question is a very, very good question. one of the reasons the Charlotte-Mecklenburg experiment is so widely known nationally is that it said mixing the kids up helped the poor kids but didn't hurt the rich kids. That was what that story said. Now, you guys look. I mean, I realize I'm sort of preaching to you about something you must know a lot more about than me, and I want to be more modest in what I say about it. But you know, Richard, basically, fundamentally, I think that the reason that we need to try multiple solutions, that list has got lots of different things on it. The reason we have to try multiple solutions is because not all of them are going to work equally well every place. And we can't start off by saying, well, I've got the perfect solution. If only I could find the perfect community and the perfect citizens to make it work. Well, that's not likely to find that, and therefore we got to, you know, if I've told you what I think is right for schools, but I mean, the other thing I would say is, it's also true that early childhood education would make a huge difference. Huge difference. It would be great if we had more. It would be great if we had more. I think it would be good for all of America if we had more bridging social capital. Our kids met more often with kids who were unlike them. But even if we don't do that, which I think would be great, we could make a lot of progress if we just thought about these isolated poor kids and thought about their need for responsible adults in their lives. So mentoring is not a trivial thing to do. It would be great if we could provide lots of opportunities for poor kids to engage in skill building exercises, but the least we could do is to stop charging them for learning soft skills. I mean, that just seems, honestly, that just seems to me beyond belief that we're charging for extracurricular activities when that is just as important as algebra.
Question there.
Hey, how you guys doing? My name is Clarissa Brooks, sorry. I'm a sophomore at Spelman College representing Generation Nation today with Ms. Farrow. And my question, as a student and child born and raised in Section 8 housing, how do you have this conversation about social mobility?
Can you say that? Sorry, I missed that last bit. Can you say that again?
I'm a child of Section 8 housing.
Section 8 housing. Section 8,
yeah. So Greer Heights, Hidden Valley, that whole area in Charlotte. But how do you have this conversation about social mobility to those who are impoverished? So how do you tell people, okay, the system is set up against you, but how, in what ways can we actually work towards getting you out of that system in regards to education and mentorship and all of those things? Just making this conversation on a local level possible, because this is possible because of private sectors and public ones, but the actual people it's affecting, how do we get it to them?
Well, look, I think that since it's adults that got us into this problem, my main target, the audience I'm thinking about is mostly adults. And since it's the adults on the upside of the opportunity gap who have the potential influence and power even to make changes, most of the time I've been thinking about what should I say to adults on the upside of the gap, which happens to be many of the people in the room. How to counsel kids who are the victims of this system that we have and the growing gaps is something that actually, this is going to sound like a terrible duck. It is a terrible duck. My wife Rosemary down here happens to do a lot of mentoring of poor kids, and she knows they need structure. I'm just now channeling Rosemary. I feel she ought to stand up and tell her solutions, but she does a lot of work with poor kids, homeless kids, and other kids up at home. And I think what she would tell me to say is structure is important, self-discipline is important, and ready, steady love is important. The kids, and I'm here switching back into lecturing adults, it's not enough to be a drop-by volunteer. You gotta be there.
Yeah.
You gotta be there all the time, the way we are for our own kids. I'm sorry that's not an answer to your question. I'm just not very good at that. It's a perfectly legitimate question. I'm just not very good at answering it. I'm sorry.
Thank you. I think there's another question over there as well.
Another question over here.
I love that you have wages for low-income workers up there as one of the policy options to consider. At the end of the Gilded Age, it seems to me that one of the solutions was changes in tax structure to enable people to really receive the income that they had really earned. And if you have more income, you can afford early childhood, you can afford to stay together, reduce the stresses in your family. You can afford to live where you want to live. But it seems that in this discussion, a lot of times we go just to blaming the families that are poor and not really putting any responsibility on the people that are earning a lot of money to really fairly pay their workforce. And so I'd like to know if you want to talk a little bit more about wages and why that's up there, because for many people that gets left off of this discussion.
Yeah, it's up there, and it's up there first because I think look, this is a purple problem. I've got to step back. This is a purple problem. There are parts of this problem you can see most clearly through red conservative lenses. You see the collapse of the working class family through red conservative lenses. And you see, frankly, guys walking away from their own progeny. That you can see most clearly through red conservative lenses. But there are parts of the problem you can see most clearly through blue progressive lenses, which happens to be my lenses. And there you see the long-run effect of this 40-year wage stagnation for high school-educated men and the consequent economic stresses on poor families, on less educated families. Exactly how to change that structure, that long-run trajectory is, of course, something we're going to be debating in this year's election. We're going to hear lots of suggestions about how to fix it. That is, how to fix the income side, the income inequality side of this. And there are going to be people who say, I mean, I'm now just recounting, there are going to be some people who say that we ought to do that through wage subsidies, like the earned income tax credit, which is a way of getting more cash into the pockets of people who are working hard. There are going to be people who say that we should address that by raising the minimum wage, and there are other people who say that that's not the most efficient way to get money to the people who most need it. There are going to be people who suggest that we should have a child tax credit, so that if you've got kids, you get an extra tax credit. Technically, you have to call that. It has to be refundable. That is, even if you don't pay taxes, you still get the same amount of money. There are going to be other people who say that the way to get more jobs is to deregulate the American economy. There was even a candidate for president. I'm not going to name him. The good news, by the way, is candidates for president all of them are talking about this opportunity gap now. Really, all of them are talking. That's a great advance, because this was an issue that was just was on nobody's radar a year or two ago. There was a candidate. I'm not going to name him. He happens to be the governor of a state just west of New York. Who said that the way to address the problem that you're talking about is cutting corporate income taxes. Well, we'll have a discussion about, is that the right way to address the problem, or is it one of these other ways? And I think that ought to be very high on the agenda, because the question of how to increase the long stagnation, how to overturn the long stagnation of working class wages in America ought to be an important question. I'm not an economist, so I'm not professionally competent to make judgments. But on the other hand, all of us are going to have that. All of us are going to have that chance this year. The really nice thing about this election is that we're going to all hear from a lot of people giving us their ideas about how we begin to narrow the opportunity gap, and we should just use our brain. Does that sound like the right idea, or does this sound like the right idea?
As well as the policy debate, which you've described, which you've got some suggestions up there in your book and in the way you talk about it, you're also, I think, quite demanding of us in some ways, quite rightly, and the way that we, our responsibility to do something about this problem too. You don't just see it as a technocratic problem to be solved by policy, but also something, the whole notion about our kids is actually this sort of the sense of collective responsibility for it. So if we've come to this evening, as well as supporting some of the policies that you've recommended and listening to you, if you wanted people to be able to walk out of this door and do or say something, one or two things, what should they be? What can each of us do? And I include every single one of us, myself, all of us, Foundation, what can each of us do differently after walking out of the door tonight when we go back to work or our families tomorrow?
Yeah, that question is in part, my answer to that question is in part embodied here. There are big things that would make a huge difference that are going to be big, heavy lifts. Getting universal early childhood education in America, high quality university, I'm going to start that sentence again. Having high quality early childhood education available to all of our kids in America would make a huge difference to this problem. But that's a heavy lift. And that's not something that any of us can walk out of here tonight and do. Reversing this long tendency for there to be no increases in working class wages in America would be terrific. It would have a big effect, but that's a heavy lift. And therefore, not in the short run, but I think that it's also in this array of things, there are things that would not probably have quite that big an impact, but would have a visible impact, I assure you, and that we could do. You could all tonight write a note to your school board and say, if we have pay to play, stop it. That's costs a little money, I recognize that, but it would make a difference because it just can't be right that whether you get to play, in the orchestra should depend upon how rich your parents are. That isn't right, because that's any more than whether you get textbooks or not should depend upon how rich your parents are. And that you could do. Or you could work with, I'm sure there are lots of great local organizations here that are helping link poor kids with mentors. And you could do that. And again, not once a year stopping to have lunch to say, how's your life going? But being there in the life of that child would make a difference.
And if they're anything like the Generation Nation people that I met earlier, then that might be a good place to start. As with all things, individually and collectively, we only get to solutions once we recognise that we have a problem. And actually recognising the scale of that problem is a necessary first step to any solutions, whether they're individual or collective or local. And I don't think it's just flattery to say, Professor Putnam, that nobody has done more to animate the scale of the problem facing us than you have done in recent years. And so on behalf of everybody here tonight, I'd like to add my personal thanks to Field.